how I returned to wood turning after being away from it for a long time, and how my experience can help you. That and more, including lathe choice and necessary tools, coming up. Hi there and welcome to WB Fun Woodworking. I'm Don. I've been working with wood for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid, my dad always had a shop somewhere in the house or in a garage, and he taught me a lot of different things. One of the things he taught me was turning wood on a lathe. Actually, in those days we had a shopsmith, but it worked just fine. That was almost 50 years ago. So recently I decided I just wanted to get back into trying turning wood again. And so I bought this particular lathe. This video will be about the Nova Comet II, why I picked it, what I've liked about this particular lathe, some of the tools that I've used, and things that you might need to get started in turning yourself. I thoroughly researched all the lathes that are available today. I searched places like Facebook Marketplace, Craigslist, and even estate sales within 200 miles of my home, but couldn't find a used lathe that I liked. So I decided to buy a new lathe. The one I decided to get is the Nova Comet II. This particular package came with the chuck and the small turning tools. I checked all the different prices, and CPO outlets had the best deal, so I ordered one from them. It was delivered right to my front gate next to my shop by the Postal Service. The box came in great condition. I used the dolly to move the box inside and opened it on the shop floor. I pulled out the box that had the lathe in it, moved it over to my assembly table, and my wife helped me put it up on top of my assembly table. As you can see here from the open box, the lathe and all the tools were cradled in styrofoam. Inside the styrofoam, the lathe and all the parts were wrapped in plastic. I started pulling all the things out to make sure everything was there. One of the first things that I pulled out and identified was the instruction booklet. It did come in handy. I continued to pull all the parts out of the packaging and set them aside so I could figure out where they went on the lathe. I finally got the lathe unwrapped and I could see what parts were missing and figure out where things should go. I proceeded to unwrap all the packages with parts and laid the parts out on the table. The instruction booklet suggested that the feet should be added first, so I did that the way the instruction book said. I followed the instructions by moving the lathe to the edge of the table so that one corner of the lathe was off the table and I could screw in that particular foot. Then I continued to do that for the other 3 feet. As you can see here, that left just a few pieces to add to the lathe. The first piece was the spindle lock for the tailstock. It has to be lined up so that the bolt goes into this groove in the spindle. Next was the knob for the tailstock hand wheel. After that, I added the tool rest and the locking bolt for the tool rest. And the last piece was the headstock hand wheel. According to the instructions, it is very important to allow between 30 to 45 minutes of runtime on the DC motor brushes before turning anything or putting a significant load on the motor. So I turned the lathe on and let the motor run for at least 45 minutes. As you can hear, this lathe runs very quietly. A feature I thought was very important on this Nova lathe is it comes with an electronic variable speed control. If I turn the lathe on right now, You can hear it's going at a low speed. Turning this dial, you can hear the speed increase. That's as high as it will go on this middle belt setting, and this is as low as it will go. This feature is one that I really wanted on a lathe. The 3 different speed ranges are controlled by this belt and pulley system. If I wanted to turn pins, for example, I would put it on the fastest of the speeds possible. And if I wanted to turn bowls, I'd probably put it on the slowest speed. For both spindle work, what I'm doing right now, I'm keeping on the middle speed. It would be nice to be able to change speeds all the way through the spectrum without changing belts, but that usually comes at an extra cost. Also at an extra cost that would be great would be a digital readout. I'm not sure if there are any available for the Nova series lathes aftermarket. I know a friend who has a Powermatic and put a digital readout on that. But again, we're talking more cost. For me, I keep it at the middle speed for right now. If I decide to turn bowls, I'll slow it down. And if I decide to turn pins, I'll change the belt and speed it up. The Nova lathe does come with enough tools to actually get started turning, but they're rather limited. This is the drive center that goes in the headstock, the live center that goes in the tailstock. For larger items, this is a faceplate. And this over here is a real interesting tool. I'll show you what that's used for. If the live center gets caught in the tailstock, which it can do, this rod goes in the back here, push it, and it comes out. This is held in here by a Morris taper. The same is true of the headstock. If this drive center gets stuck in here, this gets put in here and it gets pushed out. This is the drive center that comes with the Nova lathe. It's a typical 4-tooth drive center. Some people like these, some people are not real happy with them. I can take that out. I decided to get one that seems to have better reviews. It has multi-teeth in it, and I did find that it grabs better onto the work. The lathe also comes with a faceplate that can be used for turning bowls and other large objects. Again, it's something that I haven't tried yet. I plan to try that sometime this year maybe. We'll see how things go. This is the live center that came with the lathe to go in the tailstock. It spins freely as the work spins. It is limiting though. This area here is rather large, so I may have to get a narrower one. As I mentioned earlier, the lathe came with a mini chisel set. I wasn't sure how useful these tools would be when I looked at them because they look so small compared to regular lathe turning tools. Also included in the kit was the Nova G3 lathe chuck. This chuck has a special feature that allows it to be used when the lathe is in reverse. I chose the package that includes the Nova Comet II chuck. This is a very well-respected chuck in the turning community. Nova chucks have been around longer than their lathes, I think. And this particular chuck is a well-made chuck. One thing I found though is it doesn't go down as small as I would like, and it doesn't go as large as I would like for some things. So I do have to change the jaws on the chuck if I need to turn something smaller or something larger than this chuck will hold. One of the nice features of these Nova chucks is how they're adjusted. We use a chuck key very similar to what you would use on a drill press. That gets inserted in the slot here and turned. And as it turned this way, clockwise, the jaws are expanding, as you may notice there. And to turn the other way, the chuck jaws contract. Now you can see here the limit that we have to the chuck. I had it all the way out to the biggest it could get, and this is the smallest that it can get. Changing jaws on one of these Nova chucks is fairly easy, but it does take time and effort. First of all, it would be best to take the chuck off of the lathe and not try to do it on the lathe. But each of these screws, all 8 of these screws, have to be removed, and as 2 are removed, one jaw comes off. Then once all the jaws are off, you start putting the new jaws on. And each jaw and each section on the chuck is numbered. For example, this is number 4, so this is jaw number 4 that goes in this spot. So you match up all of the jaws, starting with 1, put the jaw on, put the 2 screws in, and so forth until all the new jaws are put back on the chuck. Then the chuck should be put back on the lathe. The Nova chuck also comes with a wood worm screw that can be used for turning bowls and other large objects on the lathe. It's not one that I've used yet. It's something that I'll probably try sometime this year and see how it works. When I was turning the handles, I discovered that when I pre-drilled the hole, that I could no longer use this particular live center. It wouldn't fit. It would rattle around. So I had to switch this one out for one that looks like this. Now the hole that's been pre-drilled in the handle will fit over that. In order to drill the holes using the lathe, I had to get a Jacob's chuck. This particular chuck is just like a chuck that's on a drill press. In fact, it works the same way. If I roll it out like that, I can set the chuck, and you can see that the chuck goes forwards and backwards with the tailstock handle. So this has been a very handy thing for drilling holes. Something I would be remiss in not mentioning, especially for those of you new to wood turning, is the need for a face shield. These are an important part of wood turning. When you're working with a lathe, you're working with wood that's turning at a very high speed, and it's actually turning towards you. And a face shield is what you need to protect your face, not just safety glasses. I've seen cases where already on my lathe I had something that wasn't chucked up as tightly as I thought it was, and yes, luckily it went flying the opposite way, but it could have come flying into my face. I was watching a podcast the other day. A very seasoned wood turner was showing a spot on his forehead. He wasn't wearing a face shield, and the piece of wood that he was turning came flying off and struck him in the forehead, and so he had a little scar up there. So face shield is very important, and you need to get one. Some other tools that would be helpful to get would be some calipers. Calipers for measuring the diameter of something and making sure that you're turning to that particular diameter. I have a set of regular calipers here. This is an inch caliper that I've used. It's very handy, fractions of an inch. You can also get these that are digital. I just don't happen to have a digital one right now. And these calipers are for measuring inside. If I wanted to measure the inside of the ferrule, for example, that I was putting on the ice cream scoops, I would use one of those first and then transfer the measurement to one of the other calipers. To get started turning, I decided to get a full set of Benjamin's Best turning chisels. This turned out to be an okay decision. I really don't need all of the chisels. I'm only using a few of them to start with, and they're not the greatest quality. I know this is something that I'm going to have to work on and find some chisels that I really like. My suggestion to you would be to research chisels a little bit more than I did before you buy the first set. While I bought a whole set of turning tools, you really don't need that to get started. You'll need a parting tool, a roughing gouge, and most likely a spindle gouge if you're going to do spindle work. And once you get a little advanced and know what you're doing, a skew chisel can come in very handy. They're an excellent tool and do a lot of different things, but they're a little tricky to use. One of the most important tools to get when first starting out is a roughing gouge. Here I'm using a roughing gouge to take a square piece of wood and make it round on the lathe. The roughing gouge does this very quickly, as you can see. Another important tool is a parting tool. I'm using one to quickly round this section down so that a ferrule will fit over it. To quickly shape a piece, it's back to the roughing gouge. This particular gouge does a great job of taking off large amounts of material. The roughing gouge can also be used to smooth curved areas. You have to be very slow and careful and take off just a little bit at a time. But as you'll notice at the end when I stop the lathe, how smooth this section really is. To do the fine turning work, a spindle gouge is very handy. I'm using one here to turn beads on both ends of this handle. As you can see, I turn the gouge in order to make the sides of the beads. It can be tricky. This particular gouge does catch easily. Since I got the set of small wood turning tools with my lathe, I decided to give one of them a try. Here I'm using the skew chisel to make some extra decoration on the handles. Many people consider the skew chisel to be rather dangerous. It's really not dangerous if you know what you're doing and are careful, but it can catch and make a big mess. Here I'm using it to make a fine bead on this handle. This would have been almost impossible to do with my spindle gouge. I thought I'd say some more about turning tools, especially for those of you that are just getting started or would like to get started with turning. I started out with the traditional turning tools, and yes, they have to be sharpened. I have the large regular set that I bought, and I mentioned that earlier in the video. And I have the small set of turning tools that came with the lathe, a little extra purchase there, but it was kind of nice. I think these are going to be handy when I start turning smaller spindles or get into the point where I'm used to using them. I'm just not used to using the short, small turning tools yet, but I think they're going to be some fun, and I'll experiment with them some as we go along. Sharpening is really a big issue when it comes to the high-speed steel turning tools. I can even look at my roughing gouge here and realize that I have it kind of cattywampus there, and I'm going to have to go back and do some sharpening. I did try hand sharpening, and I was fairly successful with that, but I decided to get a Wolverine jig, which is an extra expense. I at first used a regular grinding wheel and decided to buy a CBN wheel, which is again another expense. But when it comes to turning tools, the traditional turning tools is what I was used to from before. Now you could try to get into the carbide steel turning tools that they have. Those are really nice. I understand that there's some things that you can't do with those that you can do with traditional turning tools. They're expensive. They cost a lot per tool. You may not need as many to get started, although I think you need the 3 basic ones to get started. One that's round, one that's squared off, and one that's like a triangle. I haven't tried those yet, I have to admit. But that's something that I'd like to get into. I was listening to somebody the other day and they said that you have to really replace those carbide tips fairly often if that's all you use to turn. So that's something that you might want to look into as well. So if you're going to turn, you're going to have to use some turning tools. Probably a mixture between the traditional high-speed steel turning tools and the carbide turning tools is something that's what most turners do, and that's something that you'll probably have to look into as you get into turning. Another one of the special features that I looked for in a lathe was a reverse switch. If I reach in and turn the lathe on right now, it's going in the forward direction. To put it in reverse, I need to turn it off. Go over here, flip the switch. It has a middle section there for safety, and then I can push it down into reverse. Turn the lathe back on, and it's now going in reverse direction. Reversing the lathe, I think, is a good advantage for two things when it comes to sanding. First of all, I can put my hand on top of the piece rather than underneath it. I think this is a lot safer. I've also noticed that it sends most of the sanding dust away from me rather than toward me. Here I've switched from using a sheet of sandpaper to strips of sandpaper that they sell for turning. I'm not quite sure which I like the best yet. I'm still working on that. For things like ice cream scoop handles, I use these micro mesh pads to sand. They go up to 16,000 grit, which is fantastic. It really burnishes the wood before the finish goes on. You can see here what the wood looks like after using the micro mesh pads. I also use the reverse function of the lathe for putting on finish. Here I'm applying finish with a paper towel and the lathe is in reverse. As with sanding, this allows me to apply the finish on top of the piece rather than underneath the piece. The turning of the lathe on the paper towel with the finish on it helps to cause friction, which polishes this particular finish. Now it's back to the parting tool. The parting tool here is being used to actually part the piece off of the lathe. I turned the piece down to a small nub, as you can see here. Then I slowed down the lathe, held on to the handle, and pushed the parting tool into the piece. Eventually it will break free. Here are some projects that I've turned so far. I have videos on these on my YouTube channel. Well, I have to say overall that I'm very happy with the Nova Comet II. It's been a nice lathe to use. I have to admit though that I haven't used it a lot yet, and there's still some things that I need to learn and relearn from the past. But it's a nice lathe. Now this is considered a midi lathe, not a mini lathe. What the difference is between the two, I'm not quite sure. You'd have to check the specs on that. We are limited with length, although this does have an extension bed that will fit onto the end of it. And the other limitation is 12 inches on the spindle here. So you can only turn a 12-inch bowl if you've pre-rounded the blank. So that's pretty limiting if you want to do bowls. So if you're interested in turning, you need to look at all the specs of a lathe before you decide which one to get. I'm not one that was planning to do turning bowls, but that may be something that I'll want to do in the future. And if I do, I'll have to look into upgrading at that time. Well, if you like this video, remember to hit the thumbs up down below. Leave any questions or comments that you have. I'm always liking to get some comments. Somebody commented from Belgium the other day, and that was really interesting to see people responding from other countries. Thank you all very much for watching. Here are a couple of links to videos I've done on wood turning. If you click on the WB Fine Woodworking logo, you can subscribe to our channel. Thank you again for watching.